something that we'd be talking about probably for, I don't know, 4-6 months before the invasion happened. And I can remember talking to so many experts who were reassuring me all the way through that this would not happen, that Putin would not invade. And yet you looked at the evidence of all of the build-up on the border, not just of troops, but of field hospitals and things like that. And I thought to myself, you don't do this unless you really do plan to invade. And that, of course, is what he did. And I think most people expected him to bulldoze his way through Ukraine and probably defeat Ukraine within a very short time. I'm not going to say hours or days, but probably within a few weeks. Didn't happen like that. And the Ukrainians have had huge resilience. I think we've all been impressed at their stoicism, at the way that they have fought back. Let's not forget that certainly there are several 100,000 people who've lost their lives in this conflict. I mean, Putin has sent probably 200,000 Russian soldiers to their death. We don't know how many Ukrainians have died, but it will be a significant figure. I think I've seen figures speculating at 80 to 100,000 Ukrainians. And of course, the international response, I think, has been very interesting, where you've had NATO united in a way that I don't think it has been since the Cold War. You've had some countries outside what would be described as the West behaving, I think, inexplicably. Some countries like, India I'm going to pick out as one, which I think the Indian government has been an absolute disgrace over Ukraine. And there are plenty others that seem to be, if they're not offering support to Putin, they're at least not criticising him. Now, I don't know what their populations think of those governments' actions, but to my mind, it is reprehensible that any country can support another big country invading a smaller country. Because if you support that, what you're doing is saying that the whole rules of international discourse, the whole rules of international behaviour that we all would like everyone to abide by, you support them being shattered. The United Nations has been an absolute disgrace in this war in many ways, I think, because and you might say, well, they didn't have any alternative because Russia is on the Security Council. Well, then the rest of the Security Council ought to have dealt with that situation in some way. But I think we in this country can be rather proud of what we have done to support Ukraine in many, many ways. Not just on the humanitarian side. We have taken in lots of Ukrainian refugees. Some people say not enough, but there have been a lot that have come here. And I think they appreciate what this country has done. And if you go to Ukraine, and believe me, I'd love to do a program from Ukraine. Everybody I know that's been there says that essentially we are considered, and all the polls actually bear this out, we are considered their number one ally. And we have provided military help in a way that many other countries possibly were a little late in doing. A lot have caught up now. So I think that we can look in the mirror and be proud of the way that we as a country have reacted to the war in Ukraine. But the object of this hour is not to pat ourselves on the back, but it is to look at the situation that Ukraine is in a year on and try and work out what's going to happen over the next few months. Maybe, I hate to say it, but maybe the next couple of years. 0345 6060 973. We want to take your calls, and we've got two guests with us. Air Marshal Edward Stringer, he was on the programme a couple of weeks ago, you may remember, former Director General of Joint Force Development at the UK's Strategic Command, the body which links the UK armed forces together, and also previously the Assistant Chief of the Air Staff in the Royal Air Force. And joining us live from New York, it's our old friend Ben Judah, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council and author of the book Fragile Empire, which is a study of Vladimir Putin's Russia, and the upcoming book, This is Europe, The Way We Live Now. Ed, thank you very much for coming in. And Ben, very good evening to you in New York. Ben, let me start with you. We've done this at least 2 or 3 times in the past, sort of taking calls from listeners, and more at the beginning of the war than maybe in the last few months. But since we last spoke, so much has changed, hasn't it? Where do you think we are in this war?
I think that there are kind of several levels to this war. The first level, which is Ukraine's fight for survival, we're at the end of that. Ukraine has survived, and we can be confident now that Vladimir Putin is highly unlikely to roll into Kiev or bring the main cities of Ukraine under a new form of Russian imperial domination. So that phase is coming to a close. But there's a longer term war here, which is a kind of war of attrition that Putin has decided to engage with us with, and on the front lines of Ukraine. And here, we don't know how long that's going to last, with these almost World War I-like front lines running through Bakhmut and these constant assaults that the Russian armed forces and the various mercenary groups they have are pushing for. So in one sense, the first phase is over, but the second phase, we don't know how long that's going to last or what kind of costs that's going to put on Ukraine or on the Western democracies supporting her.
Huge numbers of calls coming in, which I'm not surprised by, I have to say, but I welcome that. But if you don't get through the first time, do keep trying. And if you want to watch us, you can do so on Global Player. We're streaming this on Global Player. Ed, where do you see this situation now? Is it something that a year ago you would have predicted that it would end up like this?
Yes, sadly, I am on record somewhere. I think Cambridge University, 3 days, when I had an emergency event 3 days after it happened, I said this will be a lot longer and nowhere near as easy as Putin thinks. And that's because I think if you read deeply, and not everyone can, I appreciate that, into the defence intelligence, you realise that Putin only had enough money to really modernise the bits of his armed forces that were useful to him when he wasn't at war, the submarines in the North Atlantic and things he used in Syria. And actually it was a bit of a paper makeover for his Green Army. And it became clear quite early on that most of his usable troops had been thrown across the border. That's only about 200,000 troops. He's only really got about 300,000 now after a year of mobilisation. I don't think there's any more. We, the Western Allies in 1944, put close to 200,000 troops across the beach on D-Day on day one just to hold a small bridgehead. How could you hope to take a country the size of Ukraine, the biggest country in Europe after Russia, population of 40 million, with that few troops? So he bit off a lot more than he could chew. Now he has to try and get something out of this. I agree with Ben that the first phase is over, which is the survival of Ukraine. Getting to the end of the second phase, I think the challenge to us all is to get to the end of the second phase without continuing to shed Ukrainian lives.
And the politics of this, let's move on to that before we come to calls. The NATO has been united in this. I think the European Union has been far more united in it as well. I think it's enabled Britain to maybe sort of reset some of its relations with the EU as well. But the rest of the world, I mean, I don't know whether you thought I was going over the top in what I said earlier, but I'm really quite shocked at the attitude of some countries. Ben, what do you think?
I think this is a really serious question that Western diplomacy needs to reckon with. We've had unprecedented unity within the West, and Russian propaganda has been very ineffective inside the West for this first year of war. But if we look outside, we have all of the key global players of the so-called global South, from Brazil to South Africa to India to Indonesia, taking distance or even equivalence between Ukraine and Russia. And these countries have been helping Russia evade sanctions. We've not been enforcing so-called secondary sanctions on them. That means stopping money laundering or sanctions evasion going through even so-called allies of the West, such as the United Arab Emirates or Turkey. And this is a really big question, because this is leaving the door open for Putin to build up his resources. And now, don't want to say the elephant, and I don't want to say the dragon in the room, but China is, of course, vastly larger than all of these other countries in terms of its political weight in the world. That's a huge question, and a shadow over the Munich Security Conference that just took place, which is one of the most important gatherings of the Western foreign policy elite, had this question over it, which is China about to start sending lethal arms to support the Russian army in Ukraine? Now, if they did, that would be a major turning point for China's relationship with Russia and China's relationship with the West, unprecedented since the 1970s. And it would be a major diplomatic victory for Vladimir Putin.
Ed?
We shouldn't be too surprised. India has been deliberately non-aligned, as you know, going back to the 1940s, 50s, shortly after partition.
But they're going further than being non-aligned. I mean, they're actually tacitly supporting Russia.
They would point as well, wouldn't they, to the fact that when, as Rusi showed, when you pull apart a lot of the Russian weapons, you can find some Western microchips and stuff in there. They'll point to the amount of money, Russian money, that's been laundered through the City of London in the last couple of years. If you're in the global south and you depend on Europe for your food, and they depend on both Russia and Ukraine for a huge amount of grain, as you're well aware, Ian. This looks like, once again, World War I, World War II. This is the Europeans having a really big scrap, and the rest of the world suffers. Having said that, remember Modi did step out from behind that position of non-alignment at Samarkand at the meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and he was quite blunt and direct with Vladimir Putin back in the autumn of last year. So I think India will probably be taking a slightly different position in private with Putin, and I think we have seen Xi Jinping has certainly been reining him in. Xi Jinping will not want to see the nuclear taboo being broken. So I think you might find diplomatically behind the scenes these powers have acted to restrain Putin.
Right, we're going to come to your calls in a moment. If you want to talk about how we've got to where we are, or indeed what might happen over the next few months, we have two brilliant voices on the programme, Air Marshal Edward Stringer and Ben Judah from the Atlantic Council. You're listening to LBC. I'm Iain Dale. It's 8:15.
This is LBC.
Watching on Global Player, we have Ben Judah with us and Air Marshal Edward Stringer. I've got lots of calls coming in, but I'm actually going to start off with a text. Mark in Kilburn says, soon after the war started, a big emphasis was placed on sanctions against Russia. Can your guests explain how effective these sanctions have been so far? Ben, let me throw that one at you. We haven't got Ben's sound. Or Ben, have you muted yourself?
Moderately. There was an expectation that the sanctions would be more decisive than they have been in weakening Russia on the battlefield and as an economy. And that's because all sides of this war have turned out to be more resilient than they expected. Ukraine turned out to be a lot more resilient. This is a country that's been bombed through the winter with Russia targeting its very sources of heat and its energy generators. Europe turned out to be a lot more effective and resilient faced with Russia's own energy sanctions on us. And yes, Russia turned out to be more resilient, but sanctions are very much wearing down Russia's capacity to replenish that army.
Ed?
Yeah, so the headline figures suggest that the sanctions haven't achieved much, but look behind them. The gas prices really buoyed Russia over the last autumn and into the winter. In fact, the price is plummeting now. The Russian receipts are really low, and they are having to shell out their reserves at the moment. So Russia's now got into deficit. It's going to be difficult to pay to rebuild its military. And the other part of sanctions, you hinted at it earlier, is things like high-tech subcomponents. It doesn't make much, and actually China doesn't make all that much either. And I think the key here for the West, everyone will look at the battlefield. The key for me is to keep the sanctions regime on and prevent Russia being able to build the sort of high-tech weaponry that it could push into Ukraine.
Right, let's go to Andy in Southport. Andy, hello, what would you like to say?
Yeah, hi Ian, thanks for taking my call. First of all, I'd just like to say I've had the opportunity for the last 12 months to go to Ukraine 4 times, and I've been to the West Ukraine and also Poltava and the Kiev region. And for 20 years, I've been either living or traveling to Ukraine, and the transition from what was normality to what I've seen in the last 12 months is heartbreaking in terms of family life, in terms of children without their fathers, without with family breakdown and lack of facilities, hospital facilities, and care and schools. And it's not just about the actual conflict situation in Donbass. It's also about the terrible impact on family life in terms of people and how they've suffered in day to day. The sirens going off 24/7, sleep, lack of sleep, stress, and people really need to understand that yes, many thousands of Ukrainian soldiers have died, and obviously many Russian soldiers too, but the impact on society and the impact on normal people's lives has been horrific. Food prices in Ukraine now, inflation is 20% plus, and with the pension around 3,500 hryvnia, which is around £100 a month for a pensioner, they're lucky to be able to pay their bills and buy food. So, society generally, even away from the conflict regions, it's caused terrible stress, and society itself is in a very, very, very depressing situation.
Okay, Andy, thank you very much. Let's go to David in Gravesend. Hello, David.
Hello, Ian. Hi. I've got a couple of questions for your panel. One, how many more weapons would the West be prepared to provide to Ukraine? And two, what would be considered a major escalation of the war to lead it to a nuclear war?
I mean, that's interesting, that last one, in that this was a matter of debate right at the beginning, and then it seemed to fade away, and now it seems back on the agenda for debate. Ed, do you want to take that first?
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? I think Biden's played this quite well. Many people have said he's been quite cautious, but if you look at the acceptable band, I think someone being on the slightly cautious end of that has been no bad thing. But as I hinted at earlier, I think as Putin's wave of terror on Ukraine, and your previous caller mentioned that. I mean, look at the kidnappings that have gone on. Why is that not a bigger story? The hundreds of thousands of children shipped to Russia. I think the world has realised, and as I mentioned before, I think you'll find Xi Jinping and others have said to him, use nuclear weapons and you can forget any help. So you've got to posit that Putin becomes a madman and decides suicide by the use of nuclear weapons, and then you get into all sorts of Dr. Strangelove territory, which I won't get into. I think the chance of them being used is going down. I think it is decreasing.
Going down?
I think it's going down.
I imagine if I did a poll of my listeners, most people would think they were going up.
No, I don't think so. I think the challenge now in this, and we will not know what's gone on in diplomacy behind the scenes, but you know that Biden will have been talking to Xi Jinping on this. He'll have been talking to Modi. He'll have been talking to those who have an open channel, and those who've been assessing it have said, Putin will know that any attempt to use nuclear weapons will finish off his regime in Russia. And I know a lot about nuclear weapons. I'm not making light of the threat. But I think if you look at Russian threats, there's been a lot of saber rattling. And when it's tested, they actually back down. So this business about the START talks, which appeared the other day, they pulled out the START talks, that's another attempt to try and keep the issue of nuclear weapons on the table. Remember, there were 3 events around the start of the invasion, all centred on Russian nuclear weapons. He was trying to tell everyone, back off, I'm a nuclear power. And that was quite shocking at the time. No one has put nukes that overtly onto the table before. But each time he threatens it, and actually you see there is no readiness, there is no bringing his forces up to any form of advanced readiness, then actually the threat is starting to look increasingly hollow.
Ben, is this a matter of debate in US media about the likelihood that nuclear weapons could be used?
No, I really share that assessment. And there's a very good report today in the Financial Times, which is very well sourced, which has 2 interesting kind of revelations for us. One is that when Putin was using this nuclear rhetoric, the Russians received a letter from the United States, Britain and France, so the Western nuclear powers, saying that if they did decide to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, they would annihilate Russia's conventional forces in Ukraine. And that this threat was taken so seriously by the Kremlin, so the second part, that they wargamed out how would a use of nuclear weapons actually help them achieve their objectives in Ukraine? And they concluded it wouldn't. It wouldn't help them advance and take more territory and more cities. It wouldn't help them resist the sanctions noose, which would only be considerably tightened afterwards. And it might, through the risk of direct American intervention in the war conventionally, lead to an even swifter and more brutal defeat.
Wow, that's quite something. I must admit, I've missed that Financial Times report. That sounds absolutely fascinating. David, thank you very much for your call. Let's go to Shri, who's in Wembley. Shri, what would you like to say?
Hello, mate. I just wanted to say, I think one of your previous callers did cover this bit on India, why it's not getting involved. I think India should not get involved for the very reason because it's a war. And we shouldn't be escalating wars, but de-escalating the wars. And moreover, India has never invaded another country, or it's never been involved in major wars apart from Pakistan. And when India was fighting wars or dealing with Pakistan and it asked for help, nobody helped them, though everybody knows where the hub of terrorism is. But now everybody's complaining as to why India is not helping or why is it supporting Putin.
Well, I don't think. Can I explain why I said what I said earlier? Because to my mind, if you believe in the international order, rules-based order, then surely you have to condemn the invasion of one country by another, particularly if it's a very powerful country like Russia invading one of its neighbours. Because it could, I mean, India is a very big country. I think in the next 10 or 20 years, India is going to be regarded as one of the world's superpowers. And I think, therefore, it is incumbent on a country like India to stand up for the international rules-based order.
Exactly. That's the very reason why Modi did say that, Putin should stop this war, be civil, let's carry on, in a normal fashion rather than escalating the war. Apart from that, he shouldn't be, sending more troops or ammunition like Britain or America or other countries are doing. Because if you escalate the war, it's never going to end. They will come back to you at some other point. They might, press a nuclear button at some point. Putin is a madman. Everybody knows that, Rather than escalating it, you have to de-escalate it, and not complain as to why another country is not, getting involved in the war, I believe.
Well, I'm not suggesting that India should get involved in the war. All I'm suggesting is that India should condemn an aggressor in this way. Ben Judah, what do you think about India's position?
Well, I think that India's position will come under increasing scrutiny given that India is hosting the G20 summit of the world's most powerful industrialized countries in the New Delhi area later this year. And we can already see behind the scenes that whilst India is keen to benefit from cheaper Russian resources flowing its way, it's trying to align closer with the United States in ways that check the rise of China. So the question for the Americans is how tough to be on India, how far to push it, and how far to link. If you want help on China, we want help on Russia. So far, the Washington attitude is that it doesn't really matter, ultimately, that India is doing more trade with Russia. And it's more important to have them happily on our side for any possible future confrontation with China. So I think that there will be more scrutiny on India, and I think they will be pushed slightly more in a sort of Western-aligned direction. I don't expect that they will be forced to choose.
OK, we'll keep your calls coming. Shri, thank you very much indeed for yours. 0345 6060 973 is the number to call. It's 8:30. Let's get the latest news headlines on LBC with Daryl Jackson.
3 men are being questioned over the shooting of a detective in Omagh, which police say sent children running in sheer terror. John Caldwell had been coaching young footballers before he was targeted. He's in a critical condition. Disgraced Hollywood producer Harvey Weinstein's been jailed for another 16 years for rape and sexual assault. He pleaded for leniency during the court hearing in LA, telling the judge his accuser was an actress who can turn the tears on. And the Environment Secretary has admitted tomato shortages could last another month. Supplies of peppers and cucumbers are also being hit by bad weather in Spain and Morocco, though Therese Coffey's suggested people can eat turnips instead. LBC weather clear and cold for much of England and Wales tonight, rain moving south across Scotland and a low of -1.
This is LBC.
You're watching on Global Player. We have Air Marshal Edward Stringer with us, former Director General of Joint Force Development at the UK Strategic Command. What is an Air Marshal? I mean, it sounds terribly grand.
It sounds like a large bloke with a concealed weapon and wearing too much polyester. Lieutenant General or Vice Admiral.
Is that the equivalent?
That's the equivalent.
Right, okay. Ben Judah is Senior Fellow of the Atlantic Council. He's written a book called Fragile Empire, which is a study of Vladimir Putin's Russia, and the upcoming book, This is Europe, the Way We Live Now. Now, I was going to ask you both about Putin, but John in Wembley has got there first, so let's hear from him rather than me. Hello, John.
Good evening, Ian. Thanks for taking the call. Yes, my question is, hopefully this conflict will finish this year or next year at the latest. It's going to finish sometime, hopefully. What's the plan the West has for dealing with Russia after Putin is hopefully taken out some way or another? I mean, Russia is still going to be there. And there's going to be, I don't know the full population of Russia, but Russia and Ukraine are going to be there. And what's my point is that I would hate to see something happen like has happened in the Middle East, say like Iraq or Syria or Afghanistan, and country is going to rack and ruin, basically. Yeah. I mean, I totally condemn what Putin has done, but at the end of the day, there's going to have to be some discussion with whoever is in charge in the Kremlin to try and progress and hopefully something like this never happens again.
Okay. The Russian population is 143 million, I'm told. Ben Judah, this is right up your street, I guess. You obviously have studied Putin in great detail. But what does defeat look like for Putin, and what happens then, as John asks?
I think that a strategic defeat of Vladimir Putin in Ukraine, which is what the West would like to see, would involve a Ukrainian offensive breaking that land bridge that he's established between the areas that he'd previously occupied in eastern Ukraine around Donetsk and the areas he previously occupied in Crimea. In this war, he's managed to establish a land bridge between the two. And if an offensive this summer could reach the Sea of Azov, if a city like Mariupol or Melitopol could be liberated, I think that would turn a failed war into a rout in terms of elite perceptions in Russia and domestic perceptions more broadly there and internationally. So the second part of what a strategic defeat of Russia would look like is Ukraine in the aftermath becoming so well armed by the West and so close to the West in terms of its security ties that he or his successors would be too scared ever to start this again. And this is why the conversation about whether or not jets for Ukraine should be shipped is quite important in trying to scope out that future, which is, are we going to help Ukraine, not just for the next couple of months, but for the next few years, build up an air force that can deny Russia access to the sky and deny Russia the ability to do combined operations in Ukraine? Or are we just going to sit back and let Vladimir Putin build up an air force capable of doing that?
Ed?
Yeah, to go back to John's question, and I'll come back to what Ben said. I think he's worried about the collapsing Russia scenario, a nuclear power and it's a very valid concern. Why hasn't the West been discussing it? Because regime change earlier on is the sort of thing that could have allowed Putin to coalesce Russian society. That's what he's been saying. This is a war of the West against us. This isn't me being aggressive. And of course, as soon as the West starts hinting it's looking at regime change, then he can change the politics. He might even mobilise Russians behind him. It become their fight.
Will there be people in the depths of Whitehall sort of wargaming this?
Yes, and it's in the public space, and the think tanks and what have you are all holding conferences now, especially in Eastern Europe. I think there was one the other day in Riga or Tallinn or somewhere. The Poles have been thinking about it, saying, what comes after Putin? And I would say for the purposes of us thinking through helping Ukraine and where Ben got to in his answer, I think we ought to say, what does Russia look like at the end of this? Because you'll see, you can hear it still from Macron, you can hear it to an extent from Scholz as well. There's this view that Russia's the eternal superpower. Well, why does it have to be? That population, you had 140 million. Well, that's the population of Nigeria. It's less than the population of Indonesia. It's got an economy that's tanking. It's already been strategically defeated, as Ben said. Its demographics are awful. West has weaned itself off gas. That was its big strategic lever. And now two very capable, in all ways, countries are in NATO, Finland and Sweden. Putin's 70 this year, if not already. So this knocks Russia back for 10 years at least, depending on, as I say, on how long those sanctions are maintained. He's going to be 80. So he's going to be gone one way or another anyway. And there isn't really a transition in place because unlike in the Soviet Union, when there was actually a party and there was a Politburo and there was a sense of transition, this is a gangster leadership built around one man. So John's right to worry about what happens when that implodes. Yes, people are thinking about it. It was going to happen anyway because of Putin's age. I think his strategic defeat in Ukraine, putting Russia in a worse position, will just hasten the demise of Putin.
And Ben, if Putin left this mortal coil tomorrow, what would happen in the Kremlin? Because sometimes people think, well, it's just him, but sometimes people need to be careful what they wish for.
I think there would be some sort of repeat of what happened after the death of Stalin, in which these paranoid groups of men, sort of teamed up one against the other, purged a few people, and then eventually found a stable power-sharing arrangement and then a new leader. But I think it would be very violent, and I think that some people would definitely be purged. In terms of like the future of Russia and its relationship with the West, I think it's important to look to the Middle East for examples. And in the Middle East, there is a large, perhaps not that demographically large, but still influential and important country with a long history, which has been under Western sanctions for decades. And that country's name is Iran. And Iran has managed to keep itself going and actually prove more resilient against those sanctions than people expected. It's not been able to be prosperous enough, or not been able to kind of reorder the Middle East in its own image, but it's been very destructive and very disruptive. And that's because it's got oil and gas resources. That's because it's got those hydrocarbons keeping it afloat. And really, as long as we live in hydrocarbons age, which we can begin to see the end of now, I do think Russia is going to have the strength, or rather the authoritarians that rule Russia will have the strength to sustain some variant of an autocracy.
Right, let's move on. John, thank you very much for that very thought-provoking question. Let's go to Mandy in Sutton. Mandy, hello.
Hi, how's everybody?
Very well, thank you. All the better for hearing you. What would you like to say?
I'd like to find out that Putin himself, he's a very dominant person and wants people to bow to him and what he says. What is in place, basically, for him not to go after other countries?
You mean us?
Yeah, well, us, anybody.
This is an interesting one, isn't it? Because there are all sorts of rumours that he's got Moldova in his sights. There was even a story the other day I saw that he's got Poland in his sights. Now, that clearly would be game-changing. And there were also, when I remember having discussions about, well, if he used nuclear weapons, how would he use them? And there was a quote from someone in the Kremlin saying, well, London would be target number one, because obviously we have been very open in our opposition to him. Ed, what do you make of that?
Well, I'll build on my previous answer. I think we have to say just how strong is Russia going to be. And yes, it could be whoever replaces him could be even more hard line. But what levers will that leader have to pull? I mean, the army is now trashed. It's going to be hard to rebuild it anytime soon. So these threats against countries on Russia's border look very hollow to me, unless you have a Moldova or Transnistria, where the Russians are at the moment. But even Moldova is starting to push back.
And the likelihood of him attacking this country?
Well, there isn't a likelihood of him attacking this country. I mean, really, the Swedes and the Finns have joined NATO because They've realised Article 5 absolutely works, and they don't want to be in the position of Ukraine. Yes, we could fight them off, but we don't want to lose people, and we don't want to have to regain our territory after the initial attack. But I don't really see where the threat is coming from. And I think you will see this when Western leaders look at the promises they made on funding defence coming up, and they start to add up just how much European NATO spends on its defence, which is somewhere around 400 to 500 billion a year. Russia was spending 66, and its armed forces, clearly were nowhere near as good as most people thought they were, and even that has now been trashed, more than decimated. And they've lost almost all of their high-end stuff. So I think NATO, the West, is eminently capable of coping with the Russia that emerges from this. And I pick up Ben's point that the problem is it might just become a disruptive power in the way that Iran is a sponsor of terrorism. But no one is going to fear the Red Army rolling across its border anytime. I mean, look at Lukashenko. I mean, Putin doesn't have much leverage on Lukashenko anymore.
But wasn't there, Ben, wasn't there a report this week that there's a leaked paper from the Kremlin that says that Putin wants to annex Belarus by 2030?
That's definitely the case. And Belarus has been subjected to, what looks more and more like a slow motion annexation over the last few years. Like Russian troops have entered and are not going to leave. And we're seeing that Russian presence really remold that regime in the image of a more subject client state. In terms of the big question, though, which is how much do we need to invest in defense when faced with a weakened but still disruptive Russia, I think the answer is more than you'd think, because Russia may be weakened. It still has enormous oil and gas reserves in a world where we may be going green, but the developing world is guzzling a hell of a lot of oil and gas. There's going to be a lot of money that this dictator has to put behind his revenge. And whilst I don't think that's going to take the shape of tanks rolling over the border again, I do think Ukraine has really defeated the likelihood of that in Europe for the foreseeable future. We could see a lot more disruptive spy wars, a lot more kind of strange underhand political machinations in the soft underbelly of Europe, in the Balkans or in Moldova. And I think that if we show any weakness, they will try and find a way to exploit it, a bit like Iran does. Like Iran sponsors militias across the Middle East. Iran sponsors terrorism. Iran is continually trying to incite instability where it can against its enemies. And a big Iran is going to be quite a big problem.
Some breaking news in the last few minutes. The United Nations in New York has just voted in favour of a resolution to ask Russia to leave Ukraine. India and Iran both abstained. We'll get our panellists' reaction to that in just a moment. You're listening to LBC. I'm Iain Dale. It's 8:47.
LBC.
LBC. Well, just to recap that breaking news, the UN has just voted in favour of a resolution demanding Russia leaves Ukraine 141-7, with 32 nations abstaining. Those that voted against would have obviously been Russia, Belarus, Syria, North Korea, Eritrea, Mali and Nicaragua. Well, no people buy the company they keep, I would say. And the abstentions included China, India, Pakistan, Iran and South Africa. Ben Judah, this is just your politics in a way, isn't it? Because, I mean, a resolution in the UN, what in the end is going to come from that?
I think that it's part of a campaign that the West is running to show Russia the scale of its isolation. It's important to keep doing that. And I was just looking through the list of the countries that have voted with or against the West. And it's interesting to see that a lot of the countries in the global South are seen as pivotal have started to come over. You have Brazil that voted with the West. You have Indonesia that voted with the West. And I think that is positive in keeping the pressure on Moscow. But is a resolution going to lead to any meaningful material change on the ground in Ukraine? The answer is no. And this is why there's a debate inside government in the United States and in Britain and France to a lesser extent, which is how important is this global South question in terms of who they're aligning with or voting or not voting with? Should we put it first at the top of our agenda? Or should we put instead at the top of our agenda simply getting more weapons to Ukraine, with the idea that if Ukraine defeats Russia decisively on the battlefield, then those countries will line up in a way that's more favourable to us afterwards? For the first year of the war, I was very much in favour of that, getting more weapons to Ukraine and not getting too upset about voting patterns in the global South and not expending too much energy on them. But now with the war sinking into more attritional patterns, I do think we need to start making more diplomatic overtures to them if we're going to have to keep a tight sanctions regime on Russia for the long run.
Ed?
Yeah, well, I published something last late summer at Policy Exchange on this, and I went for both, Ben. We should be arming Ukraine, but we have rather taken the global South for granted. And both China and Russia have invested there. We can see it as cynicism, but those countries see people who talk to them and speak sometimes in their own language, and they see the West being a bit distant, a bit high-handed. So I do think we do need to invest a little bit more diplomacy in the global South, and I think the mood around the Westminster Village, if you like, is actually it's a good wake-up call for us not to take these countries for granted, and actually to up our diplomacy in that part of the world.
A text here from Robert in Norwich, who says, at the start of the invasion, I advocated on your show enabling Ukraine to destroy Russian depots, supply lines and air power to prevent material getting to the Russian front and air attacks on Ukraine. Please would you ask the Air Marshal why the Western allies have not helped Ukraine to do that?
It is an odd war in that, as we discussed, it's framed by nuclear weapons. You mentioned at the start there's carnage akin to World War I, so it couldn't get more high intensity than that. And yet Ukraine is fighting a limited war. If this was NATO against Russia, we'd be doing exactly as your caller has suggested. We'd be attacking it in the deep. Ukraine doesn't have the wherewithal to do that. And the problem earlier on, going back to escalation, nuclear weapon, possible use, was that this would look very much like NATO getting involved directly in a fight with Russia. But what I think you will see now, and Zelensky hinted at this the other day, and I think the Americans have admitted it, there will be longer range weapons coming in. And I personally don't think you're going to see great sweeping offensives. You know, people go to CNN, they love to put these big arrows on the map of these armoured thrusts. Russians don't have the troops for that. I think what you're actually going to see is more and better long-range weapons for Ukraine, and I think they are going to make life intolerable for the Russians in the bits of Ukraine that they still occupy, doing what they've done well to date. But I don't think you will see us giving them the sort of weapons where they can start to attack targets in the area of deep into Russia, into Moscow. for the reasons that we've already outlined.
Just very quickly, another text from Tom in Sevenoaks who says, I think one of the big questions is how long is this war going to go on for? I know it's not a popular thing to say, but we also need to look at the fact that we're supplying Ukraine with so much that we're running out of our own ammunition. Is that a big concern for you?
Well, it depends which bits of ammunition. I mean, look at the Challenger tanks. I think everyone has now accepted that we have run stockpiles down. I knew when I was running the MOD's operations a few years back, did that from 15 through 17, we had problems with munitions just for the fight against Daesh in Iraq and Syria. So it is a wake-up call for us. But the Challenger tanks were only really bought for one reason. It wasn't actually to defend Salisbury Plain. It was for them to move forward for just this contingency. So if we are using that materiel for the job it was built for 30 years ago, which was to defeat the Russian threat in Europe, then that's a good use of those weapons.
Right, final question from Munesh in Southall. Hello, Munesh.
Hello, Ian. I'd just like to say thank you to the panel. I'm very glad we've got a very experienced panel here from the military, and this will...
We don't just invite any old Tom, Dick or Harry on, Munesh.
I'm glad they're not called Tom, Dick or Harry. My question is, we're a year on down the line. Surely with all your expertise, you should have predicted this. And why is it now, only now?
Predicted what?
The situation that we're in between Ukraine and Russia, the fact that we now have to think about deploying our tanks and our aircraft. Surely this should have been foresight. This should have been at stage one. To defend this war against Russia.
Okay.
We need air power. We need this.
Right, we've only got a minute and a half left, Munesh. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to cut you off there. Ben, your response.
Well, I think this is a really important question for the future of Europe, which is if Putin is going to go for a long-term attritional war, thinking that he can outlast us with his oil and gas reserves, and if he is indeed going to get material support from the factories of China, airlifting him more weapons and hardware to continue this war, we're going to have to build up our defense industrial capacity in Europe. And when I say Europe, I mean with the European Union, because there's always a prospect that the United States could leave us in the lurch and walk off in another direction. Like, it's not certain the outcome of the next election. And I can tell you from going up and down to Washington every week that the mood amongst Republicans is turning away from military support for Ukraine and wanting us in Europe to pick up the slack.
Ben, are you in Washington on Tuesday next week?
I actually think I am, actually.
Right, I'm going to invite you to my book launch at the British Embassy there, so watch out for an invite.
I'll see you.
Ed?
Yeah, I think it has been a bit of a failure of the political imagination, actually, to see exactly what we're confronting here, because plenty of people did point that out. And in fact, I will be in Washington as well, because the Pentagon have asked a few contrarians.
On Tuesday?
It'll be a little bit later, back into March. Sorry,
this is going to be such a great event.
But they said why didn't we call this earlier? Because if you go and look back, there were quite a lot of commentators saying if this goes on, we need a defence industrial base, and ours is ossified to such an extent we need it for us anyway. So build it for Ukraine now, keep it for ourselves, and it's taken us too long to realise that's what we needed to do.
Ed, Ben, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Just a reminder, Ben's new book coming out soon is called This Is Europe, The Way We Live Now. Coming up in the next hour, it's a slightly awkward gear change, this one, because I'm going to ask you, do you think that university lecturers should be banned from having flings with their students? I mean, whatever next. When I was at university, I reckon about 5 of my friends had affairs with their lecturers. That's not going to be possible now if the Office for Students have their way. And what about banning relationships in the workplace completely? But if you do that, where are people actually going to meet their future partners?